Thank you, Chair, and thanks, Senator Carr. Congratulations on your appointment, Dr Marshall, and nice to have you here for the first time at Estimates. I've got some questions around coal seam gas, so hopefully either yourself or the relevant folk are in the room to help me with those. I want to start off firstly with the study entitled Field Measurements of Fugitive Emissions from Equipment and Well Casings in Australian Coal Seam Gas Production Facilities, which you released mid-last year. Hello there. Sorry, I can't see your name.
Sorry, it's Dr Alex Warners.
Dr Alex.
It's not very big, is it?
No, maybe can you just move that glass over? Thank you. There we go. Thank you very much, Dr Warehouse. And thank you also for the response to the question on notice that I've recently received. Hopefully you've got question on notice S1-124 with you that pertains to that particular study. Have a spare copy, you might like to give it to the Minister.
Sorry, I might have some different numbers here.
Oh, it's mine.
It might assist if you do have a copy. Is somebody able to give that to you? I've only got one here. I'm keen to keep it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Great. Okay, so starting off with your first response to my first question, you say that the study does not settle the question of fugitive emissions in Australia.
Sorry, Senator, do you mind just speaking up a little bit? I'm having trouble hearing.
Well,
Perhaps the mics could be turned up. Thank you. I'm just referring the officer to his response to my first question, whereby he says that the study does not settle the question of fugitive emissions in Australia. So with that in mind, I'd like to quote to you from a media release about your study from the gas lobby group, APPEA, the Petroleum and whatever they are association. I'm sure you know who I'm referring to. Quote, natural gas is up to 70% cleaner than traditional energy sources, and there are substantial environmental benefits associated with expanding natural gas production, including CSG production. Are you able to comment on whether you think that's an accurate statement in the context of it being a reflection on your report?
Well, maybe, so firstly, my name is Dr. Alex Warners. I'm the Executive Director for Energy and Resources. The question of fugitive emissions is quite, I think, an important and complex question. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's difficult for me to exactly infer what APPEA may or may not have intended to say with its media release. Maybe to outline the situation, when you just look at the stage of producing electricity from gas, I think it is probably correct to say that the emissions intensity of gas-produced electricity is significantly lower. Mm-hmm. However, you also need to look at ultimately the overall life cycle emissions of gas-produced electricity, and that's where obviously the question of fugitive emissions comes in. As a rule of thumb, we would say that if fugitive emissions are below roughly 2% of total production, the emissions are significantly lower than, for instance, coal-produced electricity. However, if they are larger than 4%, they are probably on a par or higher than coal-produced electricity. And so what we are trying to do in our work is try to get an understanding of what the level of fugitive emissions is.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that precise response. And I'm going to come back to some of the issues that you flagged, but just sticking with that report for now, your response to the question agreed that so-called mega emitters, or particularly leaky wells, are likely to occur in Australia at roughly the same rates as they do in the US or globally for that matter. Your study didn't find any of those wells, though, in your sample size of 43 wells. So once we find those mega emitter wells, would that not significantly bump up the average CSG fugitive emissions?
Well, it is correct, Senator, that if we increase the sampling size, we might find some of those emitters, and maybe the initial estimates that our study has produced may change. But certainly from the measurements that we have conducted, at that particular part of the value chain, emissions levels were very low on average, I think 0.02%.
Okay, but just confirming the sample size didn't include any of those mega emitting wells.
Well, it depends exactly on your definition of a mega emitter. What we have certainly seen in our sample is that there was a large distribution of emissions. So there were some wells that did not show any leakage. However, there were other wells, and it was a very small number of wells, that showed much more significant leakage. I might actually also add that ultimately having mega emitters might actually be the best possible outcome under the circumstances, because then you can actually focus on identifying and eliminating emissions from those mega emitters.
Sure, assuming you can find them.
Yeah,
you would
correct.
need to therefore look, of course, which sadly they're not doing. What's the plan for estimating the risk of failure of old wells? Since I think the study concentrated on new wells, and presumably the older the well gets, the more run down the casing is, and therefore the greater chance of fugitives.
Yeah. Again, given the nature of the industry, which is a fairly young industry in Australia, most of the wells are not very old. So ultimately, the only way to find out...
Sorry, could you speak up a bit with the
Sorry.
noise?
The only way to find out the long-term performance, we'll just continue those measurements.
Okay, well, look, let's move on to hopefully what is the continuation of those measurements in a stage 2 of your research. I don't know much about the scope and the funding and the timeframes of that stage 2. So, and certainly the department often refers to it as some great panacea for answering all our questions. I certainly hope so. Can you explain for me what is the scope and the funding and the timeframe of that stage 2, please?
I certainly can, Senator. So as you have referred to, the first part of the study looked at a specific aspect of the value chain. So the second part of the study looks at other aspects of the CSG production process, specifically well completions, gas compression, and water treatment.
Okay, sorry, I'll just jot that down. Well completion.
Gas compression and water treatment.
Great, thank you.
And that work has in fact already started. So we have completed the first stage of that work, which is a literature review. And we are currently in discussions with industry to conduct measurements of those aspects of the CSG production process.
Do you have any sense of the size of the sample that the second phase will... Obviously, that depends on whether industry lets you go on there to examine them, but can you give me a hint on that?
I don't at this point in time. That is literally what is being discussed with industry at this point in time.
Okay. So in terms of timeframe for the completion...
I think it was about 1%, wasn't it, of existing CSG wells were looked at. This was a pilot study.
No, that was stage 1. Minister, we're on to stage 2 now.
Yeah. You're talking about what's going to happen?
Yes.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. So coming back to stage 2, so the lit review's been done. You're in talks about how to get access to the wells. What's the time frame for finishing off stage 2?
I don't know exactly when it's going to be finished. As we have discovered in the discussions, it is actually a complex optimization problem because the point in time when the wells are actually being completed is very short, and so we need to make sure that the team is in the right location, looking at the right type of well. But I would say over the course of the year, I certainly hope we complete that work.
Okay, over the course of the year. Thank you.
So can I just say to you that Geoscience Australia, who the committee sent home, could have probably assisted a lot of your questions in relation to coal seam gas as well.
Thank
so
you.
It's a pity
Minister,
that...
I have asked them about it before, and I do have some questions for them on notice, but these questions are about a CSIRO report, so I figured CSIRO would be the best place to respond to them. Thanks, Dr. Wellhouse.
Certainly in relation to their report, we're the best to respond.
Yeah, that's what we're asking about. No, CSIRO. So coming to the funding for stage 2, what is that amount, please?
I don't know exactly off the top of my head, but I am aware that the Department of Environment has made the funding available.
Okay. So based on your response to the question or notice, you said there was 190,000 that had been allocated by Department of the Environment over 1 year. So has that changed, or is that still the same?
I would expect that it's the same, but I can certainly check that.
Yeah, thank you, if you could. That doesn't seem like a vast amount of funds to conduct what I hope will be a quite field-intensive study. Should you find that the funding is not adequate to support the ground studies that you need to do, presumably you will need to seek further funding, or would you instead contract the scope of the study?
Look, if we find we need additional funds, we would simply have a discussion with the Department of Environment to seek the best possible way to resolve that.
Okay, thank you. And sample size is still being defined. Now, in terms of the scope of the study, will you look at shale and tight gas wells in stage 2 or just coal seam gas?
My understanding is we will focus on coal seam gas. Okay.
Are there any plans to do future studies on shale and tight gas wells?
Not that I am aware of off the top of my head. There's certainly a whole range of other studies going on, but not on this particular issue.
Okay.
Just a matter of principle, Senator. Questions on process should really be directed to the Minister for the Environment. The process questions lie within their domain. So,
Minister, I've taken the appropriate matters up with the Environment Department, and I'm now taking the appropriate matters up with CSIRO about the scope of their work plan. I think you're being deliberately argumentative, Minister, with respect. The office has done quite a good job at giving me some helpful answers.
I'm not known to be argumentative. I'm normally known to be extremely helpful, and that's what I'm trying to be on this.
Well, I think the office is actually being very helpful, and I wouldn't mind continuing with the questions.
And the process questions are for the Minister for the Environment, and other matters are quite rightly directed to this officer.
I'm asking about CSIRO's future work plans. I don't think the Minister for the Environment can answer that better than CSIRO can.
But you have been asking some process questions. Can we just keep to what this officer is
Well, thank you. I'll continue with the questions that I have for this officer, and I'm sure he'll continue to answer them in the helpful manner that he's done so far.
Okay, a quick questioning is good question.
Yes, agreed. So you mentioned in the response to that question on notice that the scientific evidence base about fugitive emissions for shale and tight gas would benefit from further Australian-specific measurements. You've just responded that you're not sure if that's going to be within CSIRO's scope to do, but you said other work is being done but not on fugitives, if I understood your response correctly. So what level of confidence can we have in the ENGE's emissions factors for shale and tight gas? The greenhouse reporting.
I guess the whole purpose of the study is to determine appropriate emissions factors for coal seam gas. So at the end of the study, we will be able to determine that.
Sure. And for shale and tight gas, how can we be confident in the ENGE's methodology for ascertaining those levels if the studies would benefit from further specific measurements?
We would have to do similar work. Now, I should also say I think the key issue in Australia is actually coal seam gas, not shale and tight gas, because that's obviously the major development that's currently underway, which is why we have certainly focused our efforts on understanding coal seam gas in particular.
Sure, that's certainly what's happening at the moment, but of course many approvals for shale and tight gas are currently being sought, so clearly that's the next phase. Just sticking with phase 2, and I'm almost finished with this tranche of questions, what stages of production will you examine? You mentioned well completion, gas compression and water treatment.
Yeah, that's right.
Is there any other stages of production, or those three?
My understanding is that is currently the planned scope for this study. However, there's obviously other pieces of work that we're doing in other contexts that might look at different aspects of the CSG production system.
Could you take on notice to give me a bit more detail on those other studies, given that the clock's ticking right now? I'm interested in the full scope of work. Thank you. And I might put some detailed questions about the phases that are being examined to you on notice. Almost. Oh, sure.
Okay.
I've got
Senator
a few
Bushby.
more as well.
Yeah, you've got...
Yeah. All of my questions are on cost invest.
You finished.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you. Different report, same topic. Thank you. Great. So we're finished with phase 2 report. Can I move now to the national assessment of chemicals associated with coal seam gas extraction in Australia, which you're a contributing organisation to, although NICNAS is the lead agency, and I have asked NICNAS the questions, so I'm asking you the relevant questions for CSIRO. Can you talk me through the work that CSIRO is doing as part of that national assessment?
Yes, Senator, we are doing a number of things. We are helping to develop models that look at the propagation of chemicals. We look at I think a better understanding of the hydraulic fracturing process, and there was a third one which I can probably find for you as well.
Thank you. I don't mind if you're able to do that
Yeah.
fairly quickly. I don't mind waiting for that.
Okay, so the third one was undertake preliminary laboratory studies to identify geogenetic contaminants and radionuclides in the Australian coal seams.
Geogenetic and radionucleic, did you say? Right. Well, I've got some questions on the geogenic ones. I'm interested in the impacts of mobilising those underground contaminants, the geogenic contaminants, by fracking. Is there any intention to fund research into that, or is there any research that's already underway on looking at mobilising those geogenics by the fracking process?
Well, the fact that we are obviously contributing to the NICNAS work in this context means that is actually building on the research that we are conducting.
Okay, because NICNAS seemed to tell me that it was more about the fracking chemicals that were put into the fracking fluids as opposed to the mobilising of the existing carcinogens in the geology. Are you saying that you are looking at that second aspect as well as the fracking fluid chemicals?
That's correct, Senator.
Okay, that's good news. So that's being done in that national assessment. Is there any other fields of work being done onto those geogenics being mobilised by fracking?
I mean, the mobilisation obviously is a process that plays across a number of different fields, but that's really where we are focusing our efforts at the moment.
Okay, thank you. So the funding for that research is just the funding that's associated with the national assessment?
Correct.
Okay. Now, in terms of the scope of that assessment, again, can you confirm that it doesn't include shale and tight gas? It's just focused on CSG?
That's my understanding, Senator.
And if you can clarify for me something that I find confusing, that study is not looking at the impacts on underground aquifers. How can you look at the impact of mobilising geogenics if you're not looking at the impact on aquifers?
I mean, when you look at the modelling impacts, that obviously takes those things into account, but I think it's also important to note that there are other studies that actually quite extensively look at the hydrological issues. So when you take, for example, the bioregional assessments. And
I don't think those ones are looking at geogenics, though.
No, they don't.
That's what I'm trying to zero in on, what work's being done around whether that's going to get into aquifers, which is obviously the prime health concern.
Yes, but some of the modelling work certainly looks at having the tools at hand to understand and model the propagation.
Okay, well, perhaps if you can just give me as much information on notice to help me understand how you can look at one thing but not the other when they're sort of linked, in my view. And I'm almost finished. Thank you for your patience, Senator Bushby. Your website states that the assessment will consider the preliminary environmental risks from those geogenics being mobilised, depending on the availability of data. have you found what is the level of data that's available already?
I don't know, but I can take that on notice.
Okay, so I'm just interested in the work that you've done so far with the national assessment, have you been able to find there's already a lot of information in the field that you can refer to, or is there actually a lack of information about those geogenic things being mobilised? And just one final question. The assessment's also looking at models to predict the extent of fracture growth. What do we know so far about fracture growth, and particularly the risks associated with it?
Well, we are actually quite fortunate to have probably one of the world's leading experts on hydraulic fracturing working in CSIRO, Dr. Rob Jeffrey. He has a very good understanding and modelling tools for that help us to describe the propagation of hydraulic fractures in the subsurface, that we're also calibrating against actual measurements that we're conducting. So I would say that is a relatively well understood field.
Okay, great. If you can take on notice for me just to point me to some literature that he's prepared to help me further, that would be great.
Sure.
Thanks for your assistance.